Black girl Emily has to sleep outside on the playground every night until Officer James finds her. His tough exterior slowly crumbles as he listens to the heartbreaking story of the little girl, bringing tears to his eyes. How will this encounter change both their lives forever? Before we dive into the story, drop a comment about where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, do not forget to hit subscribe. In a quiet suburban town far from the bustling and noisy streets of the big city, Officer James Mason was on his usual patrol. Everything around him was familiar. The carefully trimmed lawns, the neat houses, sitting quietly under the fading afternoon sun. Cars slowly passed by on the streets, creating a peaceful hum that matched the slow pace of life in this town. James had been doing this job for nearly 20 years, and each day felt like the one before. Everything followed a familiar routine, like a well-wound clock. It had been a long time since he felt the rush of emotions that the job used to bring. The excitement he once felt when he first started had long been replaced by indifference and a hardened exterior. It was not that James did not care, but after years of facing difficult situations, he had learned to keep everything at a safe distance, avoiding letting emotions interfere too much with his work. That afternoon was no exception. The late afternoon sun stretched shadows across the trees, and children slowly began leaving the nearby playground. It was a peaceful afternoon. Like thousands of others James had experienced in his police career, his sharp eyes remained vigilant, but his mind drifted to another place, his empty apartment, where no one was waiting for him. James's patrol car rolled slowly through the neighborhood. As he passed by the local playground, something caused him to slow down. He noticed a little girl sitting quietly on an old swing. Her black hair reflected the fading light of the day as she gently swayed back and forth. The scene seemed ordinary, but something about it made James stop and stare. While the other children had gone home, she sat there alone with no signs of any adult around. James frowned. It's probably just a kid, waiting for her parents to pick her up. He muttered to himself, trying to push away the uneasy thoughts forming in his mind. But even his own indifferent voice sounded fake. After years of working, he had become cautious and always on guard. But he was not one to get swept up in vague feelings. He continued his patrol, but the image of the girl on the swing lingered in his mind. James's daily patrol had become routine and somewhat dull. He had once loved being a police officer because of the joy of helping others and keeping the community safe. But over time, the daily tasks had turned into dry habits, like brushing his teeth or drinking morning coffee. What once gave him pride now left him feeling empty and cold. As James drove on, his mind drifted back to his personal life. He lived alone, in an apartment where no one was waiting for him. There was a time when he believed he would have a family, someone to come home to after each shift, but life had kept pulling him away. And he kept telling himself, there'll be time for family later. But later never came. The walls of his apartment were bare, with no pictures of anyone but himself. No laughter, no shared meals, just silence. James sighed a heavy breath, full of weariness and loneliness. His chest felt tight, burdened by the feeling that something was missing. Something he could not put into words. How many times had he thought he'd find something to fill this void? But work had always come first. As James's patrol car disappeared around the corner, darkness began to fall on the playground, leaving little Emily alone. In the cold of the fading evening, a cold wind swept through, rustling the fallen leaves at her feet. The neighborhood remained quiet as always, but inside James a strange feeling started to creep in. He had no idea that his life would change forever because of that small moment, the moment he saw Emily sitting alone on the swing in the fading daylight. James's patrol car rounded the corner and disappeared from the playground. But inside him the image of the little girl sitting alone on the swing lingered. The thought of a child sitting by herself in the late afternoon made it hard for James to focus on his work. Though he did not want to admit, a sense of worry crept into his mind, making it impossible to ignore. He decided to go back. Just one more pass, James told himself, though deep down he knew he wanted to check on the girl again. He drove back to the playground, and as his patrol car pulled up to the curb, Emily was no longer on the swing. This made his stomach sink. With the caution he had developed over years of police work, James stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the playground for any sign of the girl. In the dim light from the street lamp that had just turned on, James spotted a small figure crawled up beneath the slide. He stopped for a moment, blinking as if not believing what he was seeing. It was the same girl he had seen earlier, and now Emily was sleeping on the cold ground. A strange feeling rose in James's chest. He had never encountered a situation like this. A child sleeping outside in the cold so late in the day. Something was wrong. His heart started to race as he walked closer, his police shoes making a soft crunch on the gravel of the playground. He crouched down gently and lightly shook her shoulder. "Hey, kid. Wake up," his voice unconsciously softened, losing its usual sternness. "Come on, it's getting cold." Emily stirred in her sleep and slowly opened her eyes. When her eyes met James's, there was a flash of fear in them, the eyes of a tired, anxious child. She looked so small and fragile. Under the yellow glow of the street lamp, James forced a reassuring smile, trying not to scare her. "What are you doing out here so late?" James asked, trying to keep his voice as gentle as possible. "It's getting dark and cold." Emily sat up, her eyes red, as if she had been crying. She rubbed her tired eyes and hesitated before responding, her voice so soft that James had to lean in closer to hear. "I'm waiting for my mom," she whispered. James frowned. "Where's your mom?" he asked, a heavier feeling settling in his chest. Emily lowered her head, hesitating for a moment before replying. "My mom went to find a job 5 days ago. She told me to wait here for her. She said she'd come back." Emily's words hit James like a punch to the gut. The uneasy he had felt now turned into real worry. A child had been waiting for her mother to return for 5 days, and her mother still have not come back. James struggled to keep his face calm, not wanting to scare the girl any more than she already was. "Did you say your mom has been gone for 5 days?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Emily nodded slightly, pressing her lips together as if to keep from crying. James knelt down in front of her so he could look her in the eyes. He searched for the gentlest words he could find, though inside he was filled with worry. "Where do you live, Emily?" James asked, sensing the fragility and fear in the girl, and Emily looked down at her hands, which were trembling from the cold and maybe from fear. We do not have a home anymore," she whispered. "My mom said the playground was safe until she came back." Those words hit James hard, like a blow straight to the chest. He stood there for a moment, feeling like the world around him was spinning. This little girl had been here for 5 days, alone with no home, no one to care for her. Guilt and a deep sense of responsibility swelled in his chest, but above all, there was a profound sadness as he thought of the tiny child abandoned like this. James took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. He had to handle this. Emily could not stay out here any longer. "Emily," he said softly, "you cannot stay here by yourself like this. It's not safe. Let's find you somewhere warm to stay tonight, okay?" Emily hesitated, her worried eyes glancing around the playground, the place that had become her temporary home. "But my mom told me to wait here. She whispered she'll look for me if I leave." Now James felt his heart tightened as he looked into the worried, hopeful eyes of the little girl. He knew he had to say something to reassure her, but at the same time he could not let her keep waiting in a dangerous place like this. "We'll find your mum," James promised, his voice softer than ever. "But first we need to make sure you're safe and warm, okay?" With James's gentle persuasion, Emily finally agreed. James took her hand and led her to his patrol car. As the door closed, James glanced at Emily through the rear-view mirror. She sat quietly, her sad eyes gazing out the window. looking at the playground, the place she had called home for the past few days. James drove slowly, the street lights flickering through the car windows. As darkness fell, he occasionally glanced into the rear-view mirror, his eyes carefully watching Emily, who sat quietly in the back seat. She did not speak, just stared out the window, her eyes full of sadness and heavy with worry. The car passed through the quiet streets, but inside James's mind everything was swirling. When they arrived at the police station, James turned off the engine and looked back at the little girl. He could see the exhaustion on Emily's small face, not just physical exhaustion, but the mental fatigue of a child who had been through far too much. "Are you hungry, Emily?" James asked, his voice gentle and caring. Emily shook her head, but the weakness in her eyes told him that she probably had not eaten anything substantial in days. James decided not to press the issue, knowing that food was probably the last thing on her mind right now. He opened the car door and helped her out, leading her inside the police station. In the warm light of the office, James sat Emily down in a chair at his desk. He pulled a soft blanket from the emergency supply closet and gently wrapped it around her shoulders, hoping it would provide her with some warmth and comfort. Then he went to the police break room and returned with a cup of hot cocoa and a sandwich. He placed them in front of Emily. "Try to eat something," he said, his eyes more tender than ever. Emily looked at the steaming hot cocoa in the sandwich. She nodded slightly and picked up the cup, her hands shaking from the cold and maybe from fear. As she took a sip, James could see her shoulders relax just a little. Perhaps the warmth of the food and the environment was helping Emily feel a little safer, even if only for a moment. James sat across from her, trying to move gently so she would not feel pressured. But he knew he needed to ask more questions. He needed to understand more about Emily's situation, to help her. "Emily," James began, keeping his voice gentle, "I need to know a little more about you so I can help you and your mom. Can you tell me what happened?" Emily put the cup down, her small hands still clinging to the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes lowered, as if she was struggling with her emotions inside. After a few moments of silence, she began to speak, her voice soft but clear. My mom lost her job a few months ago." Emily began, her voice choking up as she mentioned her mother. "We lived in a small apartment, but then she could not pay rent anymore. I remember my mom crying a lot, and she always tried to find a new job." James listened carefully. Every word the little girl said cut into his heart. He knew Emily's situation was tough, but hearing it from her made him truly understand the despair her and her mother had been through. "And then we were kicked out of our home," Emily continued, her voice trembling. "Mom told me the playground was safe, and she'd come back after finding a job. But it's been 5 days, and she still has not come back. Tears rolled down Emily's cheeks as she told her story. James could see her lips trembling, fear and loss evident in every word. Emily lowered her head, hiding her face in her small hands, trying to conceal the pain that was flooding out. James felt a lump form in his throat, barely able to keep his emotions in check. He had encountered many difficult situations in his career, but Emily's story, with the innocence and helplessness of a child, touched a deep part of his heart that he had always tried to keep hidden. "You've been at the playground for 5 days, have not you?" James asked, his voice gentle but laced with sorrow. Emily nodded, unable to speak. She looked down at the floor, as if trying to make herself smaller, trying to hide from the overwhelming fear surrounding her. "Where did you sleep?" James asked, although he already had an idea. Emily pointed toward the window, where a part of the playground could be seen outside, under the slide when it rained and when it was dry. "I slept on the bench." James bit his lip, trying to stay calm. He could not imagine a child having to endure something like this, sleeping under a slide in the rain. He felt his heart breaking at the thought. Emily looked up, her tear-filled eyes filled with a small glimmer of hope. "Do you think my mom will come back if I leave here? Will my mom find me?" James had to fight hard not to break down in front of her. He could not give her a definite answer, but he knew he had to help her. Believed that someone was going to help. "I do not know for sure," James said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm sure your mom wants you to be safe, and being out here alone at the playground is not safe." James stood up, trying to keep his voice steady, while his mind raced with questions and concerns. "We're going to find you a warm, safe place to stay tonight. And I'm going to work on finding your mom. I promise you that." Emily nodded slightly, though her eyes still showed worry and fear. But she was beginning to trust James. James turned away, his heart heavy with the urgency of the situation. This little girl did not just need a place to stay. Tonight she needed much more, and James knew he could not let this end here. After promising Emily he would help find her mother, James stood up and decided to take action immediately. He knew he could not let her spend another night living outside, putting aside all his usual procedures and duties. James focused entirely on the task at hand, finding Emily a warm and safe place to stay for the night. James walked toward the phone, his eyes not leaving the little girl, sitting huddled in the chair, with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He knew calling social services was necessary, but he also realized that the process could take time, and they were not always able to respond right away. Picking up the phone, he began calling local social services. and children's shelters. As he waited for someone to answer, James glanced over at Emily. She had almost finished her hot cocoa, but her eyes still carried sadness and exhaustion. In the warm light of the police station, she looked so small and lost in the unfamiliar space. When social services finally picked up, James quickly explained Emily's situation. He talked about how the little girl had been living outside for days, her missing mother, and the urgent need to find her a safe place to stay. Temporarily, the person on the other end of the line said they would arrange for Emily to stay in a temporary shelter for the night, but that it might take a few hours before someone could pick her up. James felt a small wave of frustration rising him. Despite his efforts, he could not immediately resolve the issue for Emily, but he reminded himself that he could not stop here. This little girl needed more help than just a police officer's duty. This had become personal for him, a promise he could not fail. He hung up the phone and returned to Emily, giving her a reassuring smile. "They'll come to pick you up soon," James said gently, "but in the meantime, I'll stay here with you, do not worry." Emily nodded, trying to offer a faint smile. She lowered her head, still anxious and unsure of what to do. James sat down across from her, watching her quietly for a long moment. Without saying anything, inside a storm of emotions raged. Worry for Emily and a sense of responsibility that went beyond his professional duty. He stood up and grabbed some paper and colored pencils from his desk, handing them to Emily. He hoped it might help her relax and feel a little more at ease. "Do you want to draw something?" "When I was a kid, I loved to draw," James suggested, his eyes warm and friendly. Emily looked up at him, hesitating for a moment before taking the pencils. She did not say anything, but began to draw slowly. James noticed her eyes focusing on the paper. Even if it was just simple doodles, it seemed to help her forget her worries. For a brief moment, while Emily drew, James could not stop thinking about the situation. He had encountered many children in difficult situations in his job, but Emily's story had touched him in a different way. He wondered about Emily's mother, about why she had left and had not returned. Had something happened to her, or was it something more serious? Determined to help Emily, James made a decision. He would not just hand this case over to social services. He would personally investigate her mother's disappearance. While waiting for social services to arrive, James began making plans. He knew this was not just a routine police job. This was something he had to do for Emily, and more than that, for his own conscience. This little girl needed to be reunited with her mother, and James would not stop until he found the answers. When social services finally arrived to take Emily to a temporary shelter, James stood by as she walked out of the police station, his heart heavy. Emily turned back to look at him, her eyes still filled with worry and uncertainty. "You're going to be okay," James said softly, kneeling down to be at eye level with her. "I promise we'll find your mom. We will not give up, okay?" Emily nodded, her lips pressed together, but a flicker of hope shone in her eyes. "Thank you, Officer James," she said, her voice small but full of gratitude. James watched as she climbed into the social services car and drove away inside. A steely determination formed. He was not going to let this case go unsolved. Every doubt about Emily's mother, every small clue would be followed up. He knew this was not just a police job anymore. It had become a personal responsibility. Emily did not just need a place to stay. She needed to be reunited with her mother. And James would do everything to make that happen. James returned to his desk at the station, sat down and opened his notebook. He began writing down everything he knew about Emily. This case, a series of phone calls. Investigations and searches would begin tomorrow. And James knew from this moment on, he was not just a cop doing his job. He was Emily's protector, and he would not stop until he brought her back to her mother. In his heart, the echo of his promise rang out, like a vow that could not be broken. After bringing Emily to a safe shelter, James returned to the police station with his mind fully focused on finding the girl's mother. He sat at his desk, reviewing the notes from his conversation with Emily, then stared at the phone on his desk. A strong urge surged within James. He knew he had to do something right away. The fact that Emily had been wandering alone for 5 days without her mother was unacceptable. He turned on his computer and started searching for any missing person reports in the area. But there was no match. There were no missing person reports that matched the description of Emily's mother, which only added to James's growing concern. Sarah, the name Emily had mentioned about her mother, seemed to have vanished without a trace. James decided to use his personal connections. He called old colleagues and friends working in various fields, from hospitals to restaurants, hotels and shelters in the surrounding areas. He hoped to find some lead, something that might point him to where Sarah had gone. James started calling places where Sarah might have gone to look for a job, according to Emily's story. "Hello, this is Officer James Mason. I'm looking for information about a woman who may have applied for a job at your location in the past few days," James repeated, hoping someone would have an answer for him. But it seemed every call led to a dead end. After hours of making calls, James leaned back in his chair, his eyes tired and frustration building. He had called 5 restaurants and several nearby hospitals, but none had any information about a woman matching Emily's description of her mother. The words "no one matches that description" or "I'm sorry, we cannot help" seemed to echo in his head. I stopped. James sighed, looking at the clock. It was past midnight. He knew he had to keep going. But the frustration was starting to creep into his mind. He stood up and poured himself a strong cup of black coffee, sipping it slowly as the bitterness flowed down his throat, helping him stay awake. He could not give up. The image of Emily with her worried and hopeful eyes, as she talked about her mother, haunted James. She was too innocent and helpless. In this difficult situation, James felt a deep sense of responsibility. Like never before, he could not give up, could not let this little girl wait any longer. James opened his notebook and flipped through the notes he had taken during his conversation with Emily. He started making a list of places Sarah might have gone to look for work, including restaurants, convenience stores, and even homeless shelters. He decided he would visit these places in person the next day to check. The next morning, James woke up early, ready for a long day of investigation. He drove from restaurant to restaurant, asking the staff and managers about a woman named Sarah, a manager at a small cafe. Vaguely remembered a woman coming in to apply for a job a few days ago, but he was not sure if it was Emily's mother. The woman had not left any contact information, and it seemed no one knew anything more. It was a vague lead, but James did not dismiss anything. With patience and care, James continued visiting shelters and nearby hospitals. He asked about any patients or residents who might match Sarah's description, but the answers were the same, just head shakes of regret. Throughout the day, James could not stop thinking about Emily. She was in the shelter, probably wondering if her mother was coming back, wondering if she would be reunited with her. James could not shake the responsibility he felt. This was not just a job. It was a promise he had made to Emily. He would not abandon her. That evening, James visited Emily at the temporary shelter. She was sitting on the bed, clutching a teddy bear someone had given her. When she saw James enter, her eyes lit up a little, but the sadness still lingered on her small face. "Do you have any news about my mum?" Emily asked, her voice small, but filled with expectation. James felt his heart tighten. He had searched all day, but there was still no concrete lead on Sarah. Even so, he did not want to dash Emily's hope. "I'm still looking, Emily," James answered, his voice gentle and sincere. "I've asked a lot of places, and I will not stop until I find your mom. We will find her." Emily nodded, trying to smile, though it was weak. She had been through so much for such a small child. But James could see the strength in her eyes. He could feel the hope Emily was holding on to. A fragile hope, but enough to keep her from giving up. James promised himself he would not give up the search. With every step he took, he grew more determined than ever. Sarah was out there somewhere, and he would find her. On his way home after visiting Emily, James felt a stronger sense of purpose than ever before. He was used to long investigations and cases without clear answers. But this was different this time. Everything felt personal. He would not let Emily down. He would not let her wait forever. No matter how long it took, James would keep searching. Days passed without any solid leads. But James did not give up every morning. He got into his patrol car and continued his journey to find Sarah, Emily's mother. The previous calls and meetings seemed to lead nowhere, but a strong urge deep inside James drove him to keep going. He knew he could not let little Emily down. He had promised her and himself that he would find her mother. One morning, as James sat in his patrol car, holding a hot cup of coffee in his hands, his phone suddenly rang. He answered, and the voice of a colleague from the emergency room came through. "James, I just got some information. A woman was brought into a hospital a few weeks ago after a car accident. She's been in a coma since, and there's no identification on her. We have not been able to contact any family. I think she might match the description of Sarah." James sat up straight, his heart racing. He quickly thanked his colleague and without hesitation drove straight to the hospital. His thoughts raced as he tried to stay calm. Could this be Emily's mother? If so, how did Sarah end up in this condition? And more importantly, if she had been in the hospital this whole time, how had Emily managed to fend for herself? In the playground, when James arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere was quiet, with only the sounds of machines and the soft footsteps of nurses echoing through the long corridors. A nurse guided him to the room where the accident victim was. James's heart felt heavy as he stopped outside the door. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was silent, except for the steady beeping of the machines, monitoring the woman's heartbeat and breathing. On the bed lay a woman, her face swollen and bruised from the accident injuries. Although her face was badly injured, James immediately noticed the similarities. The high cheekbones, the faint outline of her features. That could not be mistaken. It was Sarah. James felt frozen in that moment, as everything finally seemed to come together. In a complete picture, Sarah, Emily's mother, had been here all along, but the little girl had no idea. James stepped closer, his eyes resting on the face of the woman he was now sure was Emily's mother. He called for the nurse to bring him the medical file. When the nurse handed it to him, James carefully flipped through the pages, and then he stopped when he saw the name Sarah Cooper. There was no doubt now this was Emily's mother. James let out a heavy sigh. A mixture of relief and sadness filled him. Relief that he had finally found Emily's mother, but also sorrow knowing that Sarah had been lying here, unable to care for her daughter. He thought of Emily, the little girl, still waiting, with the hope that her mother would return. Now James had to face the heartbreaking reality. Emily would not be reunited with her mother as soon as she had hoped. The nurse approached and gently placed her hand on James's shoulder. "She's been in a coma since the accident," she explained. "We've tried to contact family, but no one has responded. We do not know much about her beyond the name she gave before losing consciousness." James nodded quietly, absorbing the weight of the situation. Sarah had been trying to find work to care for her daughter, but she had been in an accident on the way. This made James feel the responsibility on his shoulders even more heavily. He would have to deliver this news to Emily. But how could he tell her that her mother was not coming back anytime soon? James sat down in the chair beside Sarah's bed, his eyes gazing at her still face. His mind swirled with thoughts of how to help Emily get through this difficult time. He could not let little girl feel abandoned. He had to keep his promise to Emily that he would find her mother. And though Sarah was in this condition, he would stay by her side until her mother woke up. A wave of emotion washed over James, making it hard for him to keep calm. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the grey sky outside. What am I supposed to do now? The question echoed in his mind. He knew he had to face Emily, had to tell her the truth, but that was not going to be easy. Emily had already been through so much, and believing that her mother would come back soon was the only hope keeping her strong. But James could not hide the truth from her forever. Taking a deep breath, James turned back to look at Sarah. He knew she had fought hard to take care of Emily before the accident, and now it seemed like that responsibility was being passed to him. He walked over to Sarah's bedside and gently took her hand. "Sarah," James whispered, knowing she could not hear him. "I found your daughter Emily, still waiting for you, and I promise to take care of her until you can come back." He stood there for a long moment, then left the room with renewed determination. He had to go back to Emily, had to explain what had happened. But more than that, he had to make sure that Emily would not feel alone on this journey. On his way to the shelter, James thought about how to tell Emily about her mother, though the news was not what the little girl was hoping for. James knew that the truth was better than empty promises, and above all, James knew he would do whatever it took to make sure Emily did not face any more hardships alone. James's patrol car rolled through the familiar streets, but inside he knew that everything had changed. He had found Sarah. The journey to bring mother and daughter together was far from over. As James made his way to the shelter, his heart felt heavy. What he was about to tell Emily would change her entire world. and that thought broke his heart. Though he had found Emily's mother, Sarah's coma would be difficult news for a little girl who had been waiting every moment for her mother to return. When James walked into the shelter, Emily's eyes lit up when she saw him. But then a flicker of worry crossed her face. She seemed to sense something was wrong from the tense look on James's face. She sat on a small chair, clutching her teddy bear tightly, her big eyes filled with both hope and fear. James knew he had to be careful, had to be as gentle as possible. He sat down next to Emily, trying to smile softly to reassure her. "Emily," James began, his voice gentle but serious, "I found your mum." Emily's eyes widened, lighting up with hope. "Where is she? Is she coming back to get me?" she asked quickly, her voice full of excitement. James took a deep breath, his heart aching as he saw her reaction. He knew what he was about to say would break that hope, but he also knew he had to be honest with her. "Your mum was in an accident, Emily," James said softly, his eyes never leaving her. "She's been in the hospital this whole time. She did not abandon you, but your mum is in a coma. She cannot wake up right now." As James finished speaking, Emily's face froze for a moment. She stared at him, as if trying to process everything he had just said. Her eyes began to water, her lips trembling as she realized what was happening. Emily lowered her head, hugging her teddy bear even tighter, as if it were the only thing keeping her from breaking down. Will she wake up?" Her voice was small, nearly breaking. James felt a lump in his throat, but he nodded, his eyes full of reassurance. "The doctors are taking very good care of your mum, and they believe she will wake up. We do not know exactly when, but the important thing is that you have to be patient, and you need to remember that your mum loves you very much. She's fighting to come back to you, and now we just have to wait for her to get better." Emily did not say anything, tears beginning to fall down her small face. James could see the deep pain in her eyes. For the first time in many years, James felt his heart being squeezed, not just because of Emily's situation, but because of the painful memories from his own past, when he had lost touch with the people he loved. James could not stop himself. He leaned down and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, feeling that he could no longer keep the usual a professional distance. Emily sobbed softly, her cries choked. As she buried her head in James's shoulder, he gently wrapped his arms around her, letting her release all the pain and disappointment. They sat in silence for a moment, with only Emily's quiet sobs filling the room. "You do not have to worry," James whispered, keeping his voice calm and comforting. "I'll be here with you, Emily. We're going to get through this together. Your mom is fighting to wake up, and until she does, I'm not going to leave you alone." Emily nodded softly in James's arms, seemingly finding some comfort in his words. James's promises were no longer just words of reassurance. They were promises from the bottom of his heart. He felt a strong connection to this little girl, no longer just a professional responsibility, but a sense of protection and love he had not thought he would feel again. In the days that followed, James began spending more time with Emily. He took her to visit her mother in the hospital, each time a challenge for both of them. But he was always there to encourage her. Emily would sit by her mother's bed, holding her mother's hand, hoping that one day Sarah would open her eyes and embrace her again. One day after visiting Sarah, James and Emily took a walk. In the park near the hospital, they sat on a bench, watching the leaves gently fall in the autumn breeze. Emily looked up at James, her eyes reflecting something different, not just sadness but also trust. "Officer James," Emily began, her voice soft but firm, "you'll stay with me right until my mum wakes up." James felt his heart warm and he nodded, a gentle smile spreading across his face. "I'll always be here with you, Emily. We'll wait for your mom to wake up together, I promise." Emily smiled weakly, but there was a sense of peace in her eyes that James had not seen before. From that moment, James was not just a police officer with a duty to find Emily's mother. He had become her protector, her caretaker, and her emotional anchor. In the days that followed, James frequently visited the shelter to check on Emily, bringing her small gifts like coloring, books or dolls, to help distract her from the anxiety of waiting for her mother to wake up. He realized that, despite the difficult tasks of being a police officer, caring for Emily and helping her through this tough time was the most meaningful thing he had ever done. The bond between James and Emily grew deeper. The little girl began to open up more, not just trusting James, but also seeing him as a true family member. And for James, Emily was no longer just a case he needed to help. She had become an important part of his life, a connection far beyond duty and obligation. Every time he left the hospital or the shelter, James could not help but think of Sarah. He always hoped the day she woke up would come soon, not just for the sake of reuniting with Emily, but also because of the vague guilt he carried, that he had not been able to help before. Their lives fell into this situation. But now, with the determination and affection he felt for Emily, James knew he would never let the little girl face hardships alone. Again, their journey was still long, but James believed in a brighter future for both Emily and Sarah. The days passed with patches and hope. James continued to visit the hospital with Emily, where they sat beside Sarah's bed, hoping she would wake up each time they visited. Emily would hold her mother's hand, speaking to her in a soft voice, telling her about the things she had done during the day. about the walk she took with Officer James, and about the drawing she had made. James sat quietly by observing, his heart always heavy with the responsibility and love he felt for the two of them. One morning, just as James was finishing his shift and preparing to pick up Emily, as usual, he received a call from the hospital. His heart skipped a beat as he listened to the voice on the other end. "James, we have good news. Sarah has started showing signs of waking up." James quickly drove to the hospital, his heart pounding with anticipation at the thought of Sarah and Emily reuniting. He could already picture Emily's joy when she saw her mother after all those days of waiting. He could not believe the day had finally come, the day all three of them had been hoping for. When James arrived at the hospital, Emily was already there, her eyes shining with anticipation. He knelt down beside her, gently taking her hand and smiling. "Your mom is starting to wake up, Emily. We can go see her now." Emily looked at James, her eyes wide with joy, but also a hint of nervousness. She did not say anything, just squeezed James's hand tightly as the two of them walked slowly towards Sarah's room. As they entered, James could feel the air in the room filled with emotion, a quiet but powerful sense of hope. Sarah lay in the bed, her eyes still closed, but her fingers twitched slightly, and James knew she was starting to recover. Emily walked over to her mother, trembling as she took Sarah's hand. Slowly, Sarah's eyes began to flutter open, blinking against the bright overhead light. When her eyes finally adjusted to the light, the first thing she saw was the small face of her daughter, sitting beside her, her eyes filled with love and longing. "Mom," Emily cried, her voice shaking with overwhelming emotion. She gripped Sarah's hand tightly, unable to take her eyes off her mother. Sarah looked at her daughter, tears welling up in her own eyes. But they were tears of happiness and relief. After so much time apart, "Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice weak but full of affection. She tried to lift her hand to stroke Emily's hair, her eyes glistening as she looked at her daughter. "I'm sorry I could not come back sooner." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's okay, Mom. You do not need to apologize. I waited for you, and I knew you would come back." James stood quietly in the corner of the room, not wanting to interrupt the sacred moment of mother and daughter reuniting. But he could not hold back his own emotions. His eyes began to well up with tears as he understood that the love and patience Emily had shown had brought them back together, and now that long, difficult journey finally had a glimmer of hope. Sarah held onto her daughter's hand tightly, her eyes shifting from Emily to James. As she looked into James's eyes, a recognition slowly appeared in her gaze. Sarah seemed to remember something from the past, and then her eyes lit up. "James," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with surprise and emotion. "You're the one who found Emily, are not you?" James nodded, his eyes brimming with emotion. I found her at the playground that night. From that moment, I promised I would take care of Emily until I found you. Sarah reached out and grasped James's hand, her eyes filled with deep gratitude. Thank you for everything. James felt a wave of emotion wash over him, but he only shook his head gently. You do not need to thank me, Sarah. Emily is a strong little girl, and the two of you have fought so hard. I just did what I could. In the days that followed, Sarah continued to recover under the care of the doctors. James and Emily visited her regularly, and slowly, the bond between the three of them grew closer. Emily was not only overjoyed that her mother was waking up, but she also felt safer than ever, with both her mother and James by her side. During that time, James realized his role had changed. He was no longer just a police officer on duty. He had become a friend, a protector. And more than that, he had found a sense of family forming. Between himself and the two of them, Emily and Sarah, had helped him realize that he was not just helping them. He was receiving more than he ever expected. Love and a true connection. One day after Sarah was told she would soon be discharged from the hospital, James visited them and told Sarah that he had helped them find a small apartment nearby to start their new life. Sarah was so overwhelmed she could not speak, while Emily jumped up and down with excitement. Mom, we have a new home. Emily exclaimed, her eyes glowing with happiness. James smiled at them, feeling his heart filled with warmth. He knew that the road ahead would still have challenges, but with the bond they had built, nothing could stop them from overcoming any obstacle. And more importantly, they had become a family that James never thought he would have, but now cherished more than anything in the world. A few weeks after Sarah was discharged from the hospital, the lives of the three of them began to settle into a new normal. The small apartment James had found for the mother and daughter was not large, but it was warm and fully equipped. Sarah was slowly recovering fully, still tired from the accident, but determined to rebuild her life with Emily. This gave the two of them a sense of safety and hope for the future. One late afternoon, James drove to Sarah and Emily's new apartment. As he often did, he had been visiting them weekly, bringing small gifts for Emily, sometimes books or toys she liked. Each time he came, James felt an indescribable joy when he saw Emily's bright smile and the gratitude in Sarah's eyes. Today, Sarah and Emily had prepared a small dinner at home to thank James when he arrived. Emily ran to the door, joyfully greeting him, as she always did. "Officer James," Emily shouted. Running to hug him, James grinned and knelt down to scoop her up into his arms. "Dinner's ready. Are you hungry?" Emily asked, her eyes shining with excitement. "I'm starving," James joked, laughing with Emily as he walked into the apartment. The small space smelled of chicken soup, making the home feel even more cozy and inviting. Sarah stood in the kitchen, smiling when she saw James enter. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said, her eyes still reflecting deep gratitude. "We've prepared a small dinner to thank you for everything." James shook his head as he walked into the kitchen, his gaze soft as he looked at Sarah. "You do not have to thank me, Sarah. I'm just glad to see you two doing well. That's really what matters most." After dinner, the three of them sat around the table, laughter and light conversation filling the air. James could not help but reflect on how much had changed in his life since meeting Emily and Sarah. The small room filled with warm light, the sound of talking, and Emily's laughter had transformed this place into a true home. Not just a physical home, but a place filled with love and connection. As everyone finished dinner, Emily suddenly ran to her room and returned with a special gift. She came back holding a drawing done with simple, childlike strokes, but filled with emotion. In the drawing, three figures, Emily, Sarah and James, stood holding hands under a bright sun. At the top of the drawing, with the words written in scrawled letters, "My family." James looked at the drawing, his eyes starting to sting with tears. He took the drawing from Emily, unable to speak. In that moment, James realized he had found something he never expected: a real family. Emily and Sarah had become an irreplaceable part of his life, not out of duty or obligation, but because they were people he loved and cared for. "I made it for you," Emily said softly, her eyes sparkling with joy, "because now you're part of my family." James felt a wave of emotion rising him, but he kept his voice steady as he replied, "I'm honored, Emily, thank you." Sarah smiled, her eyes also wet, as she looked at the scene in front of her. "James, you've done so much for us, but most of all, you've helped us find hope and family." James looked at Sarah and Emily, his heart full of happiness and contentment. He no longer felt the loneliness he once had, no longer lived in an empty, silent apartment. His life had changed completely since the moment he had met Emily at the playground. In the months that followed, James's relationship with Sarah and Emily deepened. They often spent time together, having dinners, going to the park, and sometimes just sitting and talking. James was no longer just their protector, but had become an essential part of the family. Sarah and Emily had given him something he never thought he would have: love and a sense of true family. On Christmas morning, James visited Sarah and Emily's home. The small apartment was lit with twinkling lights, and the smell of cookies filled the air. Emily, dressed in a bright red dress, ran to hug James as soon as he walked in. "Merry Christmas, Officer James," she exclaimed, her smile as radiant as the sun. James smiled and hugged her tightly. "Merry Christmas, Emily." They sat down together by the Christmas tree, and Sarah handed James a small gift. James was surprised when he opened it. It was a picture frame, inside of which was the drawing Emily had made, with the words "My family" at the top. James looked at the drawing, feeling his heart warmer than ever. Sarah smiled gently, placing her hand on James's shoulder. "We can never thank you enough, James. You did not just help us find each other again. You gave us the most precious thing, a family." James nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "I do not need any thanks, Sarah. I found myself through the two of you, and now I have a family I never thought I would have." They sat together, laughter and joy filling the small, warm apartment. And in that moment, James knew he had truly found the most important thing in life: a family to love and protect. That Christmas, James no longer felt alone. He had a family, and not by blood, but by the strong bond of love and care they had built together. In the end, James realized that family is not just where we're born, but where we choose to belong. And the story of James, Sarah and Emily proved one wonderful thing: family does not have to be where we're born, but where we find deep love and connection, sometimes in the hardest of circumstances. We can find not only hope, but also lasting bonds. James found not only his purpose in life, but a family he never expected. And that's the message of this story: that love, patience, and sacrifice will always help us find happiness and belonging, no matter how difficult the journey. If you feel this story touched your heart, do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you will not miss more inspiring stories. Let's share the values of kindness, hope and love with everyone. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in future videos.